I'll be talking today about what we've learned about the assurance process through the development process of our product standard and also road testing process with over 60 companies from around the world. I want to start out by saying that I am not an assurance expert, but I think that in a way has been an asset in this process to really ask the question about what kind of confidence can we have over product carbon footprinting information, and what kind of confidence is needed for different decision making that we need to make with this information. So I'll be talking about what we've learned and a little bit of a comparison between existing corporate greenhouse gas verification processes and LCA critical review, how all of that has fed into our assurance requirements in the product standard, and then areas of further research or thinking that we've identified should be fleshed out more as product carbon footprinting becomes more widespread. So there's quite a need for assurance, and I think some of the areas that identify this need is there will soon be 3 standards: the PAS 2050, ISO 1467, and our own greenhouse gas protocol product standard. So the idea of the standardization process is to encourage the use of product carbon footprinting in both the leaders who are in the room today and also many small to medium-sized enterprises around the world, because I think we all recognize the value of this information through supply chains. At the same time, there's been quite a growth in the number of LCA studies completed around the world. One estimate by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency showed that there was over 4,000 studies completed in the last decade, with an increasing upward trajectory in that number. So that's really great for this field, too, as a subset of LCA. And then more and more stakeholders, including consumers, other businesses in the supply chain, government procurement, and policymakers, want and need access to this information, again, to make decisions. So what kind of confidence levels do they need, and how can the growth of this field accommodate that? So we launched the development process of our product and Scope 3 standards in September of 2008. Many of you in the room have been involved in one of these 5 working groups or more. And I want to focus today on one of our technical working groups, which is the Assurance and Reporting Technical Working Group. They started meeting in 2008, and in summer of 2009, they issued their recommendations to us, which were then fed into the first draft of the standard. Some of these recommendations include renaming the chapter from verification to assurance. The thinking behind this is that verification is more limited in scope, and that given the assumptions and choices in LCA, that assurance is more encompassing of that, and we've been told that it's more where the industry is going. They recommended that assurance be required in the standard, but that being said, either first or internal or third party is acceptable. The assurance providers must maintain independence of the carbon footprinting process. And in addition to other parts of the assurance process, the opinion and competencies of the assurer shall be reported with the inventory results. So we took those recommendations and put them in the first draft of the standard in fall of 2009. In January of 2010, we started the road testing of both the Scope 3 and product standards with over 62 companies from around the world and in different sectors. So this map just kind of illustrates where they're located, but obviously supply chains are global, so it was really a global effort. We wanted to see and test how the assurance requirements in the product standard and the concepts in the Scope 3 standard would work in practice. So we worked with a subset of those road testers and the assurance providers, Denosky Veritas, KPMG, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, who did an assurance readiness assessment. So it wasn't a full assurance process, but really how ready were these companies given the draft standard at the time for completing a full assurance process? And what did these assurance providers learn, and what feedback could they give to us? So these assurance providers, many of them come from more of a financial, accounting, quality, risk management background, moving into sustainability. So we didn't have an opportunity to work with like traditional engineering firms who are in the corporate greenhouse gas verification space, or specifically LCA experts, but the feedback I'll be providing is from this process. So we've already heard that the market is still evolving in this space, not just in what kind of assessment should be done, but also what kind of confidence and assurance process is needed. There's a lot of difficulty in assuring emissions outside of the company's control. Many of the existing verification concepts are focused on what kind of controls and methods companies have within their operations. But how do you do that for both upstream suppliers and also downstream emissions from consumer and the end-of-life phase? There was particular focus on future emissions. So general standards are unable to specify what the use phase profile should be for each product. That's really the work of sectors and PCRs. So using a general standard, how can assurance providers assess whether the emissions from downstream emissions, especially by consumers, are reasonable? And then we've also already heard quite a bit about data quality and uncertainty, but how do you really define data quality outside of some general criteria and indicators in a general standard? So if you have two data points, they might have trade-offs with each other. Which one is really the best for use in that inventory? And how can an assurance provider determine that? The assessment procedures differ within each company, and especially around uncertainty. So everyone recognizes that uncertainty is an important aspect of inventories, yet it's not common practice to do a full quantitative uncertainty assessment at this time. And so with both data quality and uncertainty, is there an acceptable level or a threshold for these beyond which the inventory or product carbon footprint is unassurable? I think that's still an open question that the experts in this room, we should really discuss. And I already talked about why we switched from the term verification to assurance, but assurance is really about providing a level of confidence over the study results for intended users, which in this case could be consumers, other businesses, policymakers, et cetera. So is assurance really providing confidence? Is it confidence that the footprint was conducted in conformance with the standard? Is that all they're providing confidence over? Is it, in addition to that, that the assumptions and data used are reasonable, where the standard doesn't specify that? Or is also that the results are fairly stated, such as within a given materiality threshold? I think there's subtle differences between these questions that it's important to determine what level of confidence, what question should be answered to provide decision makers the information they need. So I know we have a speaker in the next panel talking more about critical review, but I think this is an existing practice in LCA that's been used for many years, and it's interesting to contrast that practice with corporate greenhouse gas verification, which I think many of the companies and verifiers in the room are quite familiar with. So in corporate greenhouse gas verification, the objectives are conformance with the principles and the requirements of the standard. But there's also a key component of the actual greenhouse gas inventory results, so i.e. the data. How you have to assess whether that's the right data to use within a certain materiality threshold set by a program, for an example. There's also assessing the company's greenhouse gas-related controls and systems and conformance with any additional or applicable verification criteria that the company and verifier determine in the pre-assessment process or a program may specify. And then LCA Critical Review has many of this similar objectives, but it doesn't talk specifically about such as materiality threshold. So, are the methods consistent with this international standard? And I've taken this from ISO 1444. The methods are scientifically and technically valid. The data used are appropriate and reasonable. The interpretations reflect the limitations of the study, and it's transparent and consistent. So to meet these objectives, they also have different processes. So in corporate greenhouse gas verification, verifiers will issue a limited or reasonable assurance opinion. So limited assurance is typically formed in a negative language context, such as nothing has come to our attention that the results are not fairly stated, whereas reasonable has a positive. We assess that the results are fairly stated. It's a subtle difference, and can consumers particularly understand that? Along with that level of assurance is materiality. So many programs will set a materiality threshold. If an error is discovered and it is above, say, 5%, that is a material error that needs to be addressed. Corporate greenhouse gas verification typically includes site visits to the company and sampling plans. In our road testing, many companies said site visits to suppliers are just not practical, and are they really necessary? That's, again, another question. The verification is typically performed at the end of the inventory process, although not always. And many of the companies involved in the corporate greenhouse gas verification space are from financial accounting backgrounds or engineering firms. I'll briefly talk about critical review because I don't want to detract from the next panel, but it can be performed during or at the end of the study. It's reviewed by other LCA experts. ISO defines that it can be internal, external, or a panel of interested parties, which is typically 3 experts. And your practitioners incorporate the panel's findings and recommendations prior to publishing the study. So I think that contrast and the need to make sure that the assurance requirements in the product standard are not overly burdensome, because we don't want this to be an obstacle for companies adopting the standard. We've designed the latest round of assurance requirements, keeping all of these recommendations in mind. So this is the requirements of the product standard as of about finalized them last week and waiting for the last round of comments. But the inventory shall be assured by a first or third party. Companies shall choose assurance providers that are sufficiently independent of and have no conflicts of interest in the process. And you shall report an assurance statement with your inventory report. And that includes the level of assurance achieved, which is that limited or reasonable I was talking about, or the critical review findings, because we do want to incorporate critical review as an option to fulfilling the assurance requirement. And you can see the rest of the inventory report assurance requirements right there. So while we're happy with this outcome, there's still a lot of areas of continued research, or maybe just continued thinking with other experts. I think there's still this issue of how the relationship between uncertainty and data quality and assurance. How can we standardize practices on the acceptable level of uncertainty and assurance? So how can we standardize maybe another way to phrase it is the professional judgment around uncertainty across multiple verification firms and experts. There's still an issue of the separation between historic emissions that have already occurred in your supply chain and future emissions from consumers in the use and end-of-life phase. One potential solution we've heard from others is perhaps a split assertion and opinion is needed. So for historic emissions, you can use more traditional verification procedures, and for future emissions, you could use perhaps like a validation approach used in project accounting. However, is that really serving the marketplace? is still unclear. The role of product category rules, I think is important in this space. So as much as product category rules can further specify which allocation method to use for this process, what's the preferred data source, how to define your use profile end of life, I think that will lower the uncertainty around assurance and further standardize this practice. And then I added up here the cost trade-offs. So, the cost of corporate greenhouse gas verification and critical review can vary widely. In the corporate greenhouse gas verification space, we've heard for a company of different sizes, it can run between $30,000 to $50,000 US. If we want to encourage companies to do multiple product carbon footprints on different products, would the cost of that be a barrier? So we want to get this information out there. Is the cost of verification going to impede that? So I may have left you with more questions and answers, but I'm hoping to hear from the rest of you over the next day and a half to try to answer some of these. So with that, I'll thank you and take any questions.